Welcome to Economy Originals, original stories of founders, brands, and global business power.
The cost of power. How Elon Musk bet his empire on Washington. In November 2024, the most powerful unelected man in America walked into Washington and announced he was going to fix the government. He wasn't a senator, he wasn't a cabinet member or a government employee. He was a volunteer. And yet, within weeks, he had access to the personal data of hundreds of millions of Americans, the power to fire tens of thousands of federal workers, and the personal cell phone numbers of nearly every Republican senator in the country. His name, in case you've somehow managed to avoid the news for the last few years, is Elon Musk. And this is the story of what it actually cost him to get there. By the first quarter of 2025, Tesla, the company Musk built into the most valuable automaker on the planet, reported that its profits had collapsed by 71%. Revenue was down 9%. The stock had shed more than 40% of its value since December, and the reason analysts kept coming back to wasn't competition from China, or supply chains, or the price of lithium. It was simpler and more uncomfortable than any of that. Tesla had become a political symbol, and millions of people had decided they didn't want to buy it anymore. Think about what that means for a second. One man's political choices wiped out more value from his own company than most corporations are worth in total. That's not a side effect. That's a consequence. And here's what makes Musk different from every other billionaire who's ever flirted with political power, and why this story is worth telling carefully. This isn't the first time he's been here. In August 2018, Musk sent a tweet, 11 words, "Am considering taking Tesla private at $420. Funding secured." At the time, Tesla was trading at $356. No deal had been structured. No board had approved anything. The funding was not, in fact, secured. The market moved immediately. The stock surged. Then, when the truth came out, it fell just as fast, and investors who bought in between those two moments lost real money. The SEC filed a fraud complaint. Musk settled. He paid $20 million, stepped down as chairman, and agreed to have Tesla monitor his social media posts. Then, in 2025, the SEC came back, this time over his acquisition of Twitter. They alleged he had deliberately delayed disclosing how much of the company he owned, which allowed him to keep buying shares at prices that were, in their words, artificially low. The advantage he gained? Roughly $150 million. The fine he paid to settle? $1.5 million. Or 1% of what they said he made. Now, you can look at those two numbers, $150 million taken, $1.5 million repaid, and reach two completely different conclusions. The first is that Elon Musk operates in a world where consequences simply don't apply the way they apply to everyone else. That the rules exist for other people, that regulators will eventually blink. The second conclusion is more unsettling. It's that Musk is playing a game that most of us don't fully understand. One where the number on the fine is almost beside the point, where the real currency isn't dollars. It's access, influence, the ability to reshape institutions faster than those institutions can respond. When he and Vivek Ramaswamy launched DOGE, they published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal. They set a target: eliminate $2 trillion in government waste, and a deadline: July 4th, 2026, America's 250th birthday. They called it the best birthday gift to the nation. The Republican senators who met with Musk privately said he handed out his cell phone number freely. One told reporters, "I just call Elon." Democrats, meanwhile, said they couldn't get a meeting. They couldn't get a call returned. Couldn't get anyone from DOGE to acknowledge their letters. That's not efficiency. That's power. And power in Washington always has a price. So here is the question this video is going to try to answer, and it's not the one you might expect. We're not going to ask whether Elon Musk is a genius or a villain. That debate has been running for years and has never once changed anyone's mind. The answer, when you trace it through the arc of the last 18 months, turns out to be more complicated, more fascinating, and more revealing about how power actually works in America than any simple verdict could capture. Chapter 1. The Blueprint. On November 5, 2024, Donald Trump won the presidential election, and within a week, Elon Musk had moved in. Not into the White House, not into any official government building, but into the process, the transition team, the appointments, the daily rhythm of an incoming administration in a way that no private citizen had managed in modern American history. 7 days after the election, on November 12th, it was announced that Musk would co-lead a new body called the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE. Alongside him, Vivek Ramaswamy, entrepreneur and former Republican presidential candidate. The reaction was immediate and divided along exactly the lines you'd expect. But before anyone had time to argue about whether DOGE was constitutional or legal or even real, Musk was already writing the mission statement. 9 days after the announcement, Musk and Ramaswamy published their op-ed. It's worth reading carefully, not because it tells you what DOGE became, because it tells you exactly what Musk said it would be. Those two things are not the same. They opened with a diagnosis. Most legal edicts in America, they wrote, aren't laws passed by Congress. They're rules written by unelected bureaucrats, tens of thousands of them every year. Most enforcement decisions aren't made by the democratically elected president or his appointees. They're made by millions of career civil servants who, in Musk's words, view themselves as immune from firing. Their solution was, on paper, precise. Not a political purge, not a power grab, a constitutional correction. They cited two recent Supreme Court rulings, West Virginia versus EPA and Loper Bright versus Raimondo, which together had significantly curtailed the legal authority of federal agencies to write their own rules without explicit congressional approval. DOGE, they argued, would use those rulings as a scalpel, identify every regulation that exceeded the authority Congress had actually granted, and cut it. Fewer regulations, fewer regulators to enforce them. Billions, potentially trillions, saved. That was the number they put in the op-ed. $2 trillion in savings. And it wasn't an aspiration. It was a target. With a deadline, July 4th, 2026. They wrote that there is no better birthday gift to our nation than to deliver a federal government that would make our founders proud. Before we go any further, there's one line from that op-ed worth pausing on, because it explains almost everything that followed. Musk and Ramaswamy described themselves explicitly as entrepreneurs, not politicians. They said they would serve as outside volunteers, not federal officials or employees. And they drew a contrast. Unlike government commissions or advisory committees, they wrote, we won't just write reports or cut ribbons. We'll cut costs. That framing matters. It positioned DOGE not as a government body, subject to oversight, transparency rules, congressional authority, legal accountability, but as something more like a consulting firm. Fast, unofficial, answerable ultimately to no one person. Economists and strategists who studied DOGE's structure from the outside identified a problem almost immediately, and it wasn't the one being debated on cable news. The problem was informational. Government, at its core, is an extraordinarily complex information system. Every agency, every department, every budget line exists because at some point, someone decided it needed to exist and built layers of process, documentation, and institutional knowledge around it. That knowledge doesn't sit in a spreadsheet. It sits in the heads of the people who've been doing the job for 20 years. A team of outside consultants, however brilliant, however well-intentioned, arrives with what researchers call a coarse information structure. They can see what looks wasteful from the outside. What they can't easily see is why something that looks wasteful from the outside might be load-bearing on the inside. And the people inside those institutions, the career civil servants, the agency heads, the bureaucrats DOGE had already declared war on, had every incentive to keep it that way, to protect their information, to slow the flow of data, to make the problem space, as one academic paper put it, as small and difficult to navigate as possible. It's a dynamic as old as organizations themselves. If you don't teach the new person how the invoicing system works, the new person can't change the invoicing system. So here was the situation by January 2025. Musk had a mandate, a famous co-author, a supportive president, and a $2 trillion target pinned to the wall. What he didn't have, not yet, was a clear picture of what he was actually cutting, or who it would hurt, or whether the people who had cheered him into the building were going to still be standing there when the bill came due. Chapter 2. The Power Game. By February 2025, DOGE was moving fast. Agencies were receiving termination notices. Federal employees were being told their positions no longer existed. Programs that had run for decades were being paused, redirected, or simply switched off. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, Elon Musk sat down with Republican senators and handed out his personal cell phone number. Not a DOGE hotline, not a press contact, his personal number to a room full of the most powerful legislators in the country. What followed was a pattern reporters kept documenting, week after week. Republican lawmakers with constituents affected by federal cuts could pick up the phone and call Elon. They could get reversals, exceptions, answers. Democrats, even those advocating for exactly the same programs in exactly the same districts, could get nothing. Not a call returned, not a letter acknowledged, not a meeting. One Democratic representative from Massachusetts described trying to unfreeze a federal grant for a manufacturer in his district. He tried DOGE. He was, in his words, stiff-armed. He eventually had to rely on career civil servants to make any progress at all. Here's where the story gets complicated, because the Republican lawmakers who had cheered DOGE into existence were about to discover a geographic problem nobody had thought through carefully enough. Of the 60 congressional districts in America with the highest concentrations of federal workers, the majority were represented by Republicans. House Speaker Mike Johnson was on the list. The chair of the House Appropriations Committee was on the list. Several of the most vulnerable Republican incumbents heading into the midterms were on the list. These were the people who had publicly celebrated DOGE's mandate, and now their constituents, federal employees, government contractors, people whose livelihoods depended on the agencies being cut, were showing up to town halls demanding explanations. Senator John Curtis of Utah went on national television and urged Musk to, quote, put a dose of compassion into the process. Senator Susan Collins of Maine said the administration was moving too fast and needed a more surgical approach. These were not Democrats. These were the people who had voted for the mandate, and they were saying, publicly, that the man they had invited in was cutting too fast and too deep. Defenders of this arrangement would say it's simply politics. Every administration is more accessible to its allies than its opponents. That's how power has always worked. But there's a reason this felt different. DOGE had been positioned explicitly in the op-ed, in every press appearance, in every public statement, as a technocratic efficiency exercise, nonpartisan, data-driven, and above the noise of political tribalism. If that framing was genuine, access to its decision-making should have been equally distributed. If a federal program in a Republican district was worth saving because it served real people, then a federal program in a Democratic district serving the same people should have been worth saving too. That's not what happened, and the gap between the stated mission and the operational reality is exactly the kind of thing that, in a finance context, you'd call a material misrepresentation. Researchers who studied DOGE's approach identified something interesting about how the operation was structured and why it was almost guaranteed to escalate. When DOGE announced its $2 trillion savings target, it established what behavioral economists call a reference point, a benchmark against which every subsequent action would be measured, and at the moment of that announcement, DOGE had saved exactly $0. It was starting deep in the domain of losses. This matters because of how human decision-making actually works under pressure. When people or organizations are operating in the domain of losses, they become systematically more risk-seeking. They take bigger swings. They escalate. They accept higher variance bets in the hope of getting back to even. It's not irrationality. It's a predictable pattern of behavior under conditions of perceived deficit. In other words, the bigger and more ambitious the target DOGE set for itself, the more aggressive it would be forced to become when reality fell short of that target. The $2 trillion number wasn't just the goal, it was a trap. Chapter 3. The Business Blowback. While DOGE was cutting its way through Washington, something was happening to Tesla that had nothing to do with electric vehicles, charging infrastructure, or competition from Chinese manufacturers. Tesla was becoming politically toxic. Not for everyone. Its existing customer base remained largely loyal, but for the broader pool of people who might have considered buying one, younger, urban, educated, disproportionately progressive, the car had acquired an association that no amount of advertising could easily shift. Buying a Tesla, in the spring of 2025, meant something it hadn't meant before, and for a significant number of potential buyers, what it meant was enough to make them look at something else. On April 22, 2025, Tesla reported its first quarter earnings. The numbers were bad by any measure. Revenue was down 9% compared to the same period the previous year. Profits had fallen by 71%, from $1.4 billion to $409 million. Gross margins had compressed from 17.4% to 16.3%. Every key metric was moving in the wrong direction. The stock had already lost more than 40% of its value since its December 2024 peak. The peak had hit on optimism that Musk's proximity to power would be good for Tesla's business. That optimism had been priced in perfectly. The reality was the opposite. Tesla's own annual report acknowledged it explicitly. The company noted that the political sentiment might be affecting sales. That is a remarkable sentence to find in a corporate filing. It's a company telling its investors, our CEO's political choices are a material business risk. On the earnings call, Musk announced what investors had been waiting months to hear. Starting in May, his time allocated to DOGE would, in his words, drop significantly. He would spend 1 to 2 days a week on government matters going forward. The rest of his attention would return to Tesla. Tesla's stock jumped 4% on the news. In a single afternoon, the market rendered its verdict. The DOGE chapter had been a liability. Its ending was a relief. Musk framed the scaling back as DOGE's mission being mostly done. He said he would continue to participate to make sure the waste and fraud that had been stopped didn't come roaring back. He spoke about it as a completed project, a success. But there's a question worth sitting with here. If the mission was mostly done, what had actually been accomplished? And at what cost to whom? The SEC case that settled in May 2026 bookends this chapter of Musk's life in a way that is almost too symmetrical to be accidental. The case began in January 2025, in the final days of the Biden administration. The SEC alleged that when Musk was quietly buying up Twitter shares in early 2022, he crossed the 5% ownership threshold in March of that year, which, under federal securities law, triggered a mandatory 10-day deadline to disclose his stake publicly. He didn't disclose it until April. By then, he owned more than 9% of the company, and in the weeks between those two dates, while the market didn't know Musk was a major shareholder, he was able to keep buying shares at prices the SEC says were artificially low. The financial benefit of that delay, according to the regulator, at least $150 million. The settlement, $1.5 million. No admission of wrongdoing, no requirement to return the $150 million. His lawyers called it a small fine for being late on one filing. That phrase, no admission of wrongdoing, appears in a remarkable number of the chapters of Elon Musk's relationship with regulators. The 2018 tweet, the Twitter disclosure. Each time, the fine is settled. Each time, the admission is withheld. Each time, the number paid is a fraction of the number allegedly gained. Whether that represents a functioning legal system doing its job, or a system being gamed by someone who could afford to play a different version of it, that's the question this video has been building towards. Chapter 4. The Reckoning. Let's try to add up the ledger. Not emotionally, not politically, just the numbers, as cleanly as we can read them. Elon Musk entered Washington in November 2024 as arguably the most influential private citizen in American political history. He had spent hundreds of millions of dollars supporting the Trump campaign. He had a public mandate, a presidential cosign, and a mission statement published in the Wall Street Journal. By May 2025, he was stepping back. Tesla had lost tens of billions in market value. The DC case that had been hanging over him for years had settled for a number his own lawyers described as trivial. And the Republican lawmakers who had been his most visible allies were publicly urging him to be more careful, more humane, more surgical. That's one version of the ledger. And if you're inclined to see Musk as someone who has overreached and paid for it, the numbers support that reading. But there is a second version of the ledger, and it requires sitting with some uncomfortable arithmetic. The federal regulations that DOGE targeted, some of them will not come back. The agencies that were restructured will not return to their previous form overnight, or perhaps ever. The legal architecture that Musk and Ramaswamy outlined in the Wall Street Journal op-ed, using Supreme Court precedents to strip authority from unelected regulators, is now in place, cited in ongoing litigation, built into administrative decisions that will take years to unwind. The SEC settled for 1 cent on the dollar of what it originally demanded. The fine for the Twitter disclosure was the largest ever levied for that specific type of violation, but it was still $1.5 million. For a man whose net worth is measured in the hundreds of billions. The consequences were real, but they were also, by any proportionate measure, small. The deeper question here isn't really about Musk at all. He is, in some ways, the clearest possible test case for something American society has been circling for decades without fully confronting. When someone is wealthy enough to absorb the legal consequences of their actions, when the fine is a rounding error, when the settlement doesn't require returning what was allegedly gained, when access to power is personal and bilateral, and accountability is institutional and slow, what does consequence actually mean? The rules exist. The enforcement mechanisms exist. The regulators exist. But if the cost of breaking the rules is systematically smaller than the benefit of breaking them, the rules are not functioning as rules. They're functioning as a tax, a cost of doing business, paid and moved on from. That's not an argument for or against Elon Musk. It's a structural observation about the system he's operating in, and it applies equally to everyone with the resources to play the same game. At the beginning of this video, we asked the question, not whether Elon Musk is a genius or a villain. That argument is perpetual and resolves nothing. The question was, what does it actually cost to be Elon Musk? And who ends up paying the bill? Here is the most honest answer we can give you. The cost to Musk personally, measured in fines, in Tesla's lost market value, in political capital expended, was significant. By the standards that apply to most people, it was enormous. By the standards that apply to Elon Musk, it was manageable, survivable, already being absorbed. The cost to the federal workers who lost jobs without warning, to the constituents in Democratic districts who couldn't get a phone call returned, to the investors who bought Twitter stock in those 11 days in 2022 while the market didn't know what Musk knew, that cost has not been settled. There is no court date for it. There is no fine. The most powerful unelected man in America walked into Washington, tried to fix it on his terms, and walked back out. What was fixed and what was broken, and for whom, will take years to fully understand. But the chapter is written, the numbers are on the table, and the question of who paid for it is one that each of you will answer differently, which is exactly why it was worth asking.